Hello, my name is Stephen Roof, and I'm the Associate Director of the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina. I'm excited to spend some time with you via this video on the topic of increasing positive interactions for students with disabilities. This video is designed to be used in schools and districts, and you can use this with individuals or groups of folks. The presentation has activities and a handout, and I'll ask it multiple times for you to pause the video and reflect in the handout that will be shared later. This presentation is brought to you by the College of Education at Clemson University's Behavior Alliance of South Carolina. The Behavior Alliance of South Carolina is a technical assistance center funded by the Department of Education for South Carolina, and we're affiliated with the Office of Special Education Services. Our Behavior Alliance exists in order to ensure that all students have an opportunity to experience a sense of belonging and engage successfully in school. We do this by partnering with state and local educational agencies to cultivate effective systems and practices. Some of those practices will be reviewed in today's training. At the end of the time watching this video, you should be able to clearly define, teach, and model positive behavior using specific evidence-based practices, and you should be able to have a concrete way of giving behavior-specific praise and feedback to students using tangible and non-tangible acknowledgements. At the end of the day, we hope that this will help you maximize instructional time and decrease problematic behaviors and disruptions. I'll first start out in this presentation by giving a general introduction of positive behavior support practices. After that, I'll talk a little bit about how to build some positively stated norms, whether that's on a school-wide, classroom, or even an individual student level. I'll talk about using those norms for teaching, how to use those norms to give feedback, whether it be through redirections and/or corrections or acknowledgements. And then I'll wrap up at the end with a closing commitment, reflection, and opportunity for you to engage with the Behavior Alliance for future offerings. First and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, this presentation has a handout, and it is meant to be interactive in a sense that you will be pausing it multiple times to engage in an activity with either yourself or the group of people that you're watching this video with. So to get to the actual handout, it is a Google Doc, and you can either use the QR code here or type in the URL at the bottom. Either of these options will take you to a forced copy where you'll be able to save your own copy and edit it without interrupting anybody else's participation using the handout. To start us off, after having that handout, I'm going to just talk about positive support practices. And in order to talk about positive behavioral support practices, I like to start with this activity. So please make sure you have a pen or pencil, something to write with, and paper in front of you. And I would like you to take the next 2 minutes to create a drawing with the following steps. Draw a house with a chimney, draw trees near your house, and draw a background for your house. Those are your 3 directions. You should now pause the video and give yourself 2 minutes to complete this opening activity. Now that you've given yourself a couple of minutes to draw your houses, I'd like you to score your house using the following criteria. Give yourself a single point if your house has 1 story, if it has 5 windows, another point if there's smoke coming out of your chimney, a point if there are mountains in your background, and a point if your trees are cone-shaped, or another point if there are birds in the sky. You get a bonus 5 points if you have a sidewalk going to your house. Go ahead and add up your score for your house and have a brief conversation with your partners about how you just scored your houses after I gave you the directions. Well, what's the point of this opening activity? Our real takeaway here is that we have some work to do before we ding people or score them or use a rubric. And at the end of the day, the big takeaway is we've got a norm around what certain things look like, sound like, and at the end of the day, will be evaluated on in order to be equitable and fair in our practice. So using that analogy of that house, we need to front load more before we're able to do certain things with or even to students in the school setting. And I used this quote by one of the original folks involved in the PBIS movement, or the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports movement, to inspire this session. Until we have defined, taught, modeled, practiced, reinforced, and retaught, it is unethical for adults to punish. So if you think about this from the perspective of the build the house activity I just gave you, we have a lot of work to do before we can start dinging and scoring students in terms of their behavioral work. And so this session is going to focus on each of the elements in Rob Horner's quote to ensure that we have effective positive behavioral systems in place to increase those positive interactions for students. So thinking through what this might look like, we here at the Behavior Alliance support a systematic approach towards building school-wide systems in order to increase those positive interactions for students. With school systems, we work to teach a consistent set of norms across all settings in a building. We help support putting in place acknowledgement systems for appropriate behavior. We help build continuum of consequences, or like I like to call them, progressive discipline systems. And we use regular data collection to inform how we're doing and future iterations or interventions of this work. For the purposes of the classroom level, we also support specific practices that are outlined here. And at the end of the day, it's the first two that I'm really talking about in today's presentation. Those classroom systems include the posting, teaching, reviewing, and reinforcement of a specific set of norms and skills, and having in place a way to acknowledge appropriate pro-social behavior when we see it. When you're thinking about the purposes of this session and this video, I'm going to ask you to narrow your focus to one of three areas. You can think about this rest of this session through the lens of your entire classroom. You can think about it through the lens of a small group of students, or you can think about it through the lens of an individual student. Regardless of which of the three you pick, my advice is to pick one of them and focus for the rest of the session on one of those audiences. The next section of this presentation and video are going to focus on the following building positive support practices. First of all, we'll talk about norms. After that, we'll talk about redirections, and then we'll end by talking about feedback. In first thinking and talking about norms, I like to say that norms are kind of the big overarching umbrella that we would like to see from all of the members of our community. The most common behavioral norms across the United States are actually safe, respectful, and responsible. So you'll see me use those three norms across most of this presentation. At the end of the day, safe, respectful, and responsible are great umbrella terms, but we need to define them further with specific behavioral skills that are observable and measurable across our systems. So when we're thinking about something like respectful means something different to different communities, different folks, and different folks of different backgrounds. So at the end of the day, we want to think about being contextual to the environment we're serving and the students and the community that's in front of us when we're building out the definition of some of those larger behavioral norms. When you think about specific examples, I have some listed here for safe, respectful, and responsible that I've pulled from a real school. You can see that underneath the behavioral skills, they are clearly defined, they are observable, and they are measurable. So if we take something like safe, using walking feet only is a really easily observable thing in front of us, especially if we define that further for students as needed. And when I mentioned before about thinking about the context of the community that we're serving, you'll notice that under respectful, there's a skill that has eyes on the speaker. In certain contexts, eyes on the speaker may be considered actually disrespectful for a young child to have their eyes at the level of an adult. So we just want to make sure whatever we're building is appropriate to the context that we're serving. At the end of the day, we really just want to be clear and define what our norms are, what our umbrella terms are, and really outline the specifics of those skills so we can be clear in the way that we move on to our next steps of this equation. So at the end of the day, if we're thinking about best practice, we're thinking about those norms being those big ideas, those umbrellas, or those values that apply to a specific context. Ideally, the context would be the entire school, but we could think about this for the context being a classroom, if you want to build this with your classroom of students, if you don't have those school-wide norms. But we also can individualize this for a student. So again, back to my beginning suggestion, we're thinking about this implementation being either at a school-wide, a classroom, a small group of students, or an individual student level when you're thinking about applying this work. Speaking of applying the work, here's your first application moment. It is on your handout, and it is the first moment on your handout. And at the end of the day, after you've made the decision of your focus, I want you to think about some commonly challenging behaviors. Some of the most frequent ones we hear are hitting or physical aggression, throwing objects, being disrespectful. And we want to think about what umbrella term that might fall under. So if I take my example of hitting, I'm going to think about what I want students to do falling under the umbrella of being safe. And I'm going to rephrase that in a positive light. So my umbrella term might be safe. My norm might be safe. And if I want students not to hit, I might say that I want them to keep their hands, feet, and objects to themselves. So at the end of the day, I'm going to define that behavior that I want to see really clearly under this umbrella of the skills that I want to see from students. Pause at this time to engage in the application moment on your activity sheet and have a dialogue if you're with other people about what this might look and sound like in the settings that you've chosen. Here on this slide, I've gone ahead and done this for you in terms of safe. So in safe, I might have keep hands to yourself, push in your chair, report concerns to an adult, and use walking feet. These are all clearly defined behaviors that I now can turn around and do my next step with in terms of working with students. If we think about checking in on that Rob Horner quote for our inspiration, again, if we think about all these things that we have to do, so far, I've really only covered defining our behavioral norms. So we've got one down. We're talking about simply defining. Let's move on to our next part. After we have it defined, we have a lot more work to do. And the next step is to ensure that we teach exactly what those behavioral skills are to our students. So when we use those norms, we might teach through different ways, and I'll talk about those as I go through the rest of the presentation. At the end of the day, we just want to make sure that one time isn't enough. We want to make sure we're constantly teaching, reteaching, redirecting, and acknowledging using this language so it becomes universal across the setting that we're working in. In first starting about reviewing behavioral norms, I'm going to give you an example. I don't know about some of you, but when I taught in the classroom in math class, I used a lot of manipulatives. And sometimes those manipulatives were paper-based. And at the end of the day, I wasn't the greenest person, and I might have had students throw some of those things away. And when I was teaching, I would often have the challenge of having kids just throw those things from their seat into the trash can, and it became a little bit of a basketball session. So when I think about building out what I expect of my students, I'm going to make sure that I'm telling them exactly what I want, and I'm going to review this prior to a problematic time. So as I've finished my direct instruction and I'm having students start on their independent work, my directions might say, we're going to start on our math independent practice work. And after you're finished using your manipulatives, I want everyone to remember to be safe by keeping your hands, feet, and objects to yourself. For us, this means that we need to remember that we're throwing trash away, and we're doing that by walking over to the trash can. I'm just going to review that simply. I might also use some modeling, which I'll also speak on later. But at the end of the day, it's a verbal reminder prior to a problematic time that I know is coming. Here's another application moment for you in your handout. I want you to think back to whatever focus you had for today and write up what you would say to either a class, that small group, or a student to prevent a challenge from occurring through reviewing. Again, think back through a problematic time, something that drives you bonkers, and find a way to write up what you're going to say to your student or students to prevent the challenge from happening. Remember to reference that umbrella term like safe, and be specific about your behavioral skill, like keeping hands, feet, and objects to yourself. Pause the video at this moment to go ahead and actually engage in this application moment. So if we're thinking about where we're at, we've defined and now worked to teach and review behavioral expectations, norms, and skills with students. So we've got another step down on our inspiration here. We're not done yet. It is not enough to deliver a simple one-time instruction to students. We've got to think about ways to reteach and continually practice those behavioral norms. At the end of the day, if a student doesn't know how to line up decimal points correctly when they're adding numbers, we find ways to continually reteach and give them practice opportunities. It's not a one-time instruction in academia and academic lands, and then you expect mastery. It's the same thing with behavior. We want to make sure we're giving many opportunities for reteaching and practicing. An example of when we might use reteaching is thinking specifically about students. How do we rephrase or restate our norm in our specific skill that they really need to show in front of you? And why I bring this up is because we want to avoid things like stop, no, don't do that, be good. Because at the end of the day, those things are super broad and doesn't actually tell students what we want to see and hear from them. So when we're reteaching and practicing norms, we want to be specific and connect back to our umbrella terms and behavioral skills. In this example, I'm going to link back to my math tangible example. Sandra in my class decided to ball up a piece of trash and throw it across the room into the trash can. To diffuse this situation, but also still give specific feedback, I'm going to walk over privately to Sandra and say, hey, Sandra, you're doing a great job of working on your independent practice. But remember, I really need people to be safe by keeping hands, feet, and objects to themselves. So would you mind please walking over, grabbing your trash, and trying to put that in the trash can safely? And then I'll walk away after delivering that reteaching. These practices that we're working on and supporting today are really meant to be universal practices to use across all students. What I mean when I say that is that about 80% of students should respond positively to this. So it's not going to work for every single student in your classroom, but we should start here and think really strategically about how we can de-escalate a scenario and give specific instructions, walk away, and let a student have a chance to build momentum with their behavioral compliance. Here's another opportunity for application. So get ready to pause the video again. But what I want you to do is think back to that commonly occurring minor behavior that you just did your review with your students on, and write up what you're going to say to a student to redirect their behavior if they don't follow that expected norm or behavioral skill. So pause the video, write up what you're going to say to an individual kid. It's perfectly acceptable if you have a kid in mind that you want to refer to. Just really think strategically about the feedback you're going to give to a student. You'll notice in my application moment that I gave the example of, I chose to use diffusing language by saying, hey, Sandra, you were doing a great job on your independent work, and then giving my feedback about what I wanted them to do. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're praising more than we're correcting. We don't want to be negative folks all the time. So it's really important to think about using that redirection skill and the reteaching opportunity as one that also builds and connects with a relationship with kids and doesn't focus just on being solely critical. At the end of the day, this is your time to practice. So please pause, use your handout, and think about what you're going to say to a student. So if we think about going in and checking on our inspiration, we just went through an example where I asked Sandra to do something again, so she had an opportunity to practice. I retaught for her what I expected. And although I didn't model in that scenario, if I was in the classroom with Sandra, I would have walked over and actually modeled what I expected from her. And I might have not done that the first time. I might have done it the second time if she did it again. But at the end of the day, we've covered now a little bit on modeling, practicing, and reteaching in that section. So we've got to think about what our last section is here, which really I'll say is acknowledging, and you could use this in terms of rewards or reinforcement. I choose the word acknowledgement because I see it as a little bit more relationship focused, but I see acknowledging as the key towards behavioral success. We need to talk a little bit about the why behind acknowledgement. I mentioned before PBIS, or positive behavioral interventions and supports, and sometimes it gets a little bit of a bad rap because folks think that it's all about prizes and posters and bribery for students. At the end of the day, the why behind acknowledgement isn't for any of those things. We want acknowledgements to serve as an opportunity to reinforce a behavioral skill. We want acknowledgements to be relationship focused, so it increases the likelihood of behavior is going to occur under similar circumstances with the same person, while also creating some rapport, respect, and positive association between a staff member and a student. At the end of the day, we don't need acknowledgements to be happening every single time an appropriate behavior is happening. We just need to make sure that they're going out more frequently than corrections. That's our biggest message. And eventually, we want to wean acknowledgements off after students have met mastery. But we should see acknowledgements as a tool in our toolbox for shaping appropriate behavior within our settings. There is a great criteria in place for acknowledging students. At the end of the day, I'll talk a little bit about that specific acknowledgement, but we really want to be clear that we're referencing that umbrella term, that norm, and the actual skill or observed behavior that we see following the norm. There is an optional here, which if you have a school-wide PBIS ticket or token or a dojo point, PBIS rewards point that is happening, you would want to pair your verbal feedback with one of those tokens, especially if it's developmentally appropriate. But at the end of the day, an example might look like, Taimir, excellent work by being safe and walking in the hallway. We're using that umbrella term of safety, and we're telling Taimir his behavioral specific skill, which is walking in the hallway. I would like you to take a moment to watch this video and think about elements of the practices we just reviewed in action.
Perfect. I love the way that Albert has it up and his hands are still on his desk, clasped together. So with PBIS, you have to maintain the 5-to-1 ratio. I mean, it's very easy sometimes to want to call out the things that you're seeing that students are not doing. You have to remember that students will model from the positives. And it's very obvious as soon as I say, oh, I really like the way that so-and-so is sitting up straight. You see all the little bodies, straighten up. Positives work, and I notice that they work better than the negatives, but I try to remind myself I need to keep it positive so that everybody follows what I want to see, and I don't want them to copy what I don't want them to see. We're probably not going to finish it all. I'm just going to have you get started on it. Okay, Lewis, go ahead and walk us in, please. Excuse me. Thank you. I love the way you guys are coming in with a voice level 0, which is our expectation.
I promise to accept no for an answer.
Nice. I promise to accept no for an answer. Good. I love how many of you are participating right now. Excellent. So in a classroom, it's all about how you frame your expectations positively. So there's a 5-to-1 ratio. You always want to make sure that the amount of times that you are positively framing your expectations are way more than how many times you address a negative behavior. You guys are doing a great job of following instructions and focusing and staying on task. Thank you. Not only did you guys put your hands up, but every single one of you were looking at me with your hands up like this. Perfect. That's excellent. That's what we want to do. I like how, I didn't even say this yet, but when everyone was sharing, the whole entire class was looking at that person. Excellent. Thank you for giving that person your attention. Okay.
Thanks for taking a moment to watch that video. I'd love if you could just capture on your handout some of your takeaways from that video. And now's a great opportunity to pause this video and have a dialogue about what you saw. I'd ask that you speak specifically about some of the practices you just heard me talk about an overview and think through how they were applied in that video. I'll also make one single note, which is in the video, you heard them speak about the 5-to-1 praise to corrections ratio. At the end of the day, that is the target that the literature will say is best in terms of creating a positive school climate. And that is really a great target. But at the end of the day, all we really want to see is more praise than corrections. Here's your opportunity to pause and discuss. I did mention that there was a slight formula towards delivering behavior-specific praise, and I think it's important to talk about this formula. We have talked about using that norm or that umbrella term like safe, and we've talked about adding in specificity beyond that norm. So you were safe by using your walking feet in the hallway. That's the description of the behavioral skill. The other two pieces that we should include is a who and an approval or a praise statement. So it is relationships first and centered if we use a student's name. So it would be great to say Mariah, and Mariah deserves to hear our praise. So we should say, Mariah, great job as our approval statement. And we'll be specific and say, for helping the students in your group get back to the task. That was so responsible of you. So I've got my norm of responsible. I have my behavioral skill that is there, which is helping students in your group get back on task. I said Mariah's name, and I gave her an approval statement. If an approval statement is a little bit difficult for you because you have different mindset around what students and the feedback should look like, what I encourage you to do is just flip that approval statement by saying something like, Mariah, you should be really proud of the way that you help students in your group get back on task. That was so responsible of you, to make it a little bit more student-centered. At the end of the day, while there is a formula to this, the steps can and should absolutely be done in any order. You've got to make this natural. If it's not natural, it's going to sound robotic and silly, and students will immediately turn you off and tune you out. So you should make sure that you make this natural and simple for you. And like I mentioned from the video, we should be following the 5-to-1 praise to correction ratio. But the most important thing is just we're being more positive than we are negative. Here's your opportunity to apply your thinking by going ahead and writing out what you're going to say to an individual student to acknowledge them. Pause the video now, write it down in your handout, and have a conversation with your group about what this looks and sounds like. Just remember to make it feel natural, put it in any order, and try your best to be authentic when delivering this to students. I'm super big on making sure I give some implementation resources because at the end of the day, I want to make sure that you have what you need to implement everything that you just heard. Here's a great implementation resource, which are some sentence starters for giving positive feedback and encouragement. When I taught, had this page printed out and I hung it up in areas of my classroom where I wanted to increase my positive feedback and encouragement to students. A good area for me on this was to put it right on the door as I was leaving the classroom. So once I had students lined up, I knew transitions were difficult, especially in the hallway or on the way to the lunchroom or to PE. So I tried to give myself that prompt, that implementation resource, a reminder that I needed to be giving out positive behavioral specific feedback. And the sentence starters also served as a way for me to shift it up a little bit instead of saying the same, you did a great job of being safe and keeping your hands to yourself. In this terms, I could say things like, hey, that was really resourceful of you. You were responsible. You helped your group stay on task. Thanks for being a real problem solver, or anything else that's here that makes things feel a little bit more authentic for you. So for checking back in on our inspiration, we've now covered acknowledgements, which is part of reinforcing positive pro-social appropriate behavior in schools. And I think Rob Horner would be pretty happy with where we're at. I do want to just mention, however, that there is a tendency for us to over-acknowledge or over-give positive behavior feedback to students' behavior that we're trying to shape. So if we think about maybe a student who's driving us a little bit bonkers in our classroom, or as I like to call them, my extra love kids, when it comes down to it, I just want to make sure that I'm acknowledging others other than that students whose behavior I'm trying to shape. One way to try to be equitable and fair in our acknowledgements is by just creating a plan and setting some goals. So this might look like, when I mention those transition moments, during transitions, I'm going to give out 2 acknowledgements to students who are experiencing and showing me those behavioral expectations. I might set a timer that goes off every 5 or 10 minutes to remind me to give acknowledgements, or I might just make it a goal over the next 45-minute class block to acknowledge at least 5 students. At the end of the day, this will help bite-size some of the pieces so that it reminds you to do things during maybe problematic times, or just to be part of your muscle memory while you're doing your general instruction. We also want to make sure that we're being fair, and we should have some ways to self-monitoring fairness when we're giving out acknowledgements. I have a few examples here on the slide for you. I really love any kind of random abilities of giving acknowledgements, especially when all students are demonstrating behavior that is appropriate. I might do this by having popsicle sticks with all my student names on them, crossing out names on a sheet of paper in front of me when I give students an acknowledgement, or if I'm using some sort of electronic system like Google Docs or PBIS Rewards or Class Dojo, I can use some random features to make sure that I'm giving everybody an opportunity to have some positive feedback from me. At the end of the day, you should think about having a plan in place, because it is pretty natural for humans to give out more feedback when certain things come up, like negative behavior. And we want to make sure we're being equitable and giving all students an opportunity to feel like they belong in your classroom or in your setting. So we've reached the end of this presentation, and we always think it's important to give you an opportunity to sit and reflect on something you're going to do differently as a result of sitting here and listening to me talk for the last several minutes. So here's your opportunity to pause, to write down a commitment, and to share it with a group of people or a colleague if you're watching this by yourself, something you're going to do differently as a result of sitting through this video. Pause now, write it down, and make sure it's time bound to hold yourself accountable for making sure that you're actually doing the practice you're putting in place. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina for watching this video. We're going to have lots of other opportunities for you to get high quality instruction, content, and ideas and practices from us as an alliance. And the easiest way to find out information about those offerings is by joining our Behavior Alliance of South Carolina mailing list. The QR code here has a direct link to that mailing list, and we send out information regularly, including our monthly newsletter, so that you keep engaged with all the work that we're doing. You can also follow us on social media through Basque Behavior as our handle on Twitter, Facebook, and most social media platforms to stay up to date and engage with us in real time. At the end of the day, I would just like to say thank you on behalf of the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina for all the work that you do for students and the communities you serve across the field of education. We recognize that it's hard, that you do hard work, and that things are challenging in this post-COVID world. And I would like to personally thank you for every single thing that you do in service and support of the students in front of you. We hope to see you at some of our future offerings, and we look forward to engaging you beyond this video. Thank you again for your time. Take care.